I'm Nick Zeppos, Chancellor of Vanderbilt University. Welcome to the Zeppos Report, a podcast where I talk with the people shaping and helping us understand our world. My guest today is retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. Can I call you Jim?
Please call me Jim.
Jim served as the Supreme Allied Commander at NATO from 2009 to 2013. He is now the Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. In June, he released his sixth book entitled Sea Power, The History and Geopolitics of the World's Oceans. Admiral Stavridis is visiting Vanderbilt to address our community about global security and risk in the 21st century. He is joining me in my office to get the conversation started. Jim, welcome to the Zeppos Report.
Chancellor Nick, it's great to be with you, sir.
Well, please call me Nick. And you have your new book out on sea power, and I've kind of dipped into it, and it's a remarkable work of history and strategy. Many people would say, well, why do we spend so much money for the Navy? We have all of this technology, and you have Tomahawk missiles, and you have all these other cruise missiles. You can wipe out a Navy. Make the case about the importance of sea power for 21st century strategy and geopolitics, Jim.
Sure. I'll give you three numbers to start. 70% of the world is covered by the oceans. In fact, you could take all the land in the world, Nick, and it would fit inside the Pacific Ocean. Secondly, 70% of your body is water, and 70% of the oxygen you breathe comes from the oceans, from photosynthesis in the oceans. With all due respect to former Vice President Gore, the lungs of the earth are not the Amazon, they are the oceans. So there's an integral part of humanity tied up in these oceans. Secondly, as we go through history, and that's really the point of sea power, so many cases, these big doors swing on small hinges of maritime battles. The Battle of Salamis, the ancient Greeks, the Battle of Actium for the Romans, Lepanto in the central Mediterranean stops the flow of the Ottoman Empire, the Battle of Trafalgar saves Britain, the Battle of Jutland in World War I, Midway in World War II, on and again. We see the history tells us the oceans matter. And then thirdly, using the oceans as a zone of operations, we can project power around the world. And we're a global nation, and I'll give you the last number. 95% of the world's goods move by sea. Internationally traded goods move on the oceans. So that beating economic sea control piece is vitally important to us. We take it for granted. If we didn't have a Navy, believe me, it would be challenged.
Well, it's very interesting because when you read some of our founding documents, there's a lot of enthusiasm about projecting naval power, obviously coming out of the British Empire. How do you think that when you go through the Battle of Jutland and Midway and Salamis, how does technology enter the equation when you even think of a Greek ship that was designed differently, perhaps, than a Persian ship? And where does technology, Jim, fit into current strategy? And is there an analog that we could see in history to help us understand the role of technology and projection and power?
Technology in the military zone is this endless dance, this pas de deux between offense and defense. And at times, defensive capabilities can shield us, and then offense overwhelms them, and then a new defense emerges, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. And that understanding of where you are in the cycle is crucial to how a military battle will turn out. A good example would be in the Second in the First World War, when the use of trenches were so embedded in the military mind. And now we come into the Second World War and we see Hitler and the German army, the Bundestag, create this new blitzkrieg style using tanks, lightning strikes, so back and forth, offense and defense. Today, what's interesting to consider, Nick, is cyber and the impact in the cyber sphere of defense and offense in the military and security zones. Our defenses are being overwhelmed by offensive cyber capability, and we better wake up in two different ways. One is we need to increase our defenses, but we also need to understand that we may be entering an era in cyber similar to what we have in nuclear weapons, where we need a deterrent regime because the defenses just are not going to stop these emerging massive cyber weapons. That's what keeps me awake at night in terms of technology and military balance, cyber.
Yeah. No, I could not agree with you more. And, even on the university front, the amount of the number of efforts to, enter our networks, penetrate, steal data, lock up data. It's frightening, and it's in many ways it can be paralyzing. What how do we think about the relationship between cybersecurity, concerns about privacy, even security about our election processes, and the role of the military? Because it's critical to have that strategy. What role do the branches play in that, do you think?
Yeah, this is a terrific question, and let me hit three very quick points about it. And the first one is really germane to the way you concluded the question. Where do the service branches play in it? Let's go back 100 years ago and look at our service branches. What did we have? We had a Navy, a Marine Corps, and an Army. We didn't have an Air Force. Right. Why? Because we didn't really fly planes. We were just starting to use them militarily toward the end of World War I. No Air Force. It took us 50 years to figure out we needed an Air Force, and we eventually created one. We don't have that kind of time in cyber. Right. We need a cyber force, and we need it now. And when a military historian 50 years from now looks back on this period in the 21st century, he or she is going to say, what were they thinking? Not to have a cyber force. We need an Army, a Navy, a Marine Corps. Of course, we need an Air Force, and we need a cyber force. Doesn't have to be huge. It's probably 5,000 to 10,000 people, highly trained, very specialized, very capable on the offensive side, also on the defensive, but really the cyber force would be the offensive arm of cyber operations. So that's point one. Point two is, in the end, however, the military is not going to solve this by itself. Cyber is the ultimate team sport. We need private-public cooperation because cyber is so ubiquitous. It goes everywhere. We can't protect it with a series of coastal forts around our borders. In effect, building walls is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You need cooperation, private and public, to make that happen. And third point is, it's going to be challenging to recruit people into the military in the cyber sphere because the competitive salaries are so great on the outside compared to what we can offer. So we rely on patriotism, sense of excitement, wearing a uniform, the respect the country accords. But we have a human resources challenge in cyber in building this new force. There's three quick points on cyber in the military.
Yeah, I think it's essential to move forward because I think it's the most frightening and paralyzing way to attack our country.
It is. And I often say, Nick, that in cyber we see the greatest gap between level of threat and level of preparation. Yeah. In other words, we had to worry about the Islamic State. We had to worry about a resurgent Russia. We had to worry about an expansionist China. But we're pretty well prepared there. Yeah. That's what our military is really keyed against. Yes. But in cyber, the level of threat is as high, maybe a bit higher, but the level of preparation is very low. That gap is what keeps me awake at night.
In your interactions, Jim, with people in the executive branch and certainly in Congress, do you think that is getting through? I mean, and does something like Equifax for better, for worse, when, half of the people in the country
Right.
could been subject to a identity theft. I mean, that's 50% of Americans. If we, when we have flu outbreaks, we all have to kind of harness the power of, biomedical research and hospitals and the government. But do you think there's a
awareness,
sense that they have to act in the key branches?
Not yet, and I have said for several years that we're going to have a cyber Pearl Harbor that is really going to wake us up. And frankly, I would have thought that the sequence that runs from Target and Home Depot, which was 60 million accounts hacked, J.P. Morgan Chase, 87 million accounts hacked, Yahoo, 500 million accounts hacked, and now the most intimate financial details of 148 million Americans. And by the way, that's actually 75% of all Americans who have credit cards. Right. So 3/4 of us have been hacked. You would think that cumulative effect would be that cyber Pearl Harbor, but it has not had that galvanizing effect. I think there are pockets in the Congress, there are individuals who are pushing hard on this, and certainly in the tech industry you see some. And the leading entity looking at cyber, however, is not tech, not the military, not the government, not academe, not medicine. It's banking. It's the big banks. The 8 biggest banks are the prime receptors right now of real cyber knowledge and capability. We, the government, could learn a lot from the way those banks have come together to form a consortium. Again, private-public cooperation is the key.
Yeah. Let me take you back to, the importance of the oceans. And, as you mentioned, 70% of the surface of the Earth, an integral part of the ecosystems of our weather. And I remember reading a book, I think, called The 10th Parallel. And it basically took you through the 10th parallel of latitude across Africa and then around the world. And it was really an effort to understand climate and the movement of people, particularly in North Africa.
Yes.
And what we might see as sectarian conflict might have been more related to the Sahel and
weather, drought.
Yeah, weather and drought. And well, we need to go south to graze, and we don't want you. And maybe you have tribal, religious differences as well. How much should we think? And then you read things about, well, you can go for the cruise through the Northwest Passage because the ice is gone. And then, well, is that international water? And I was at a conference in Canada, and the Canadians have views, and the American views, I think, are probably, well, don't take that view, Canada, because then maybe countries that you are not keen on and we aren't keen on will say, this is their water too. So how should we think of the environment and changes in the seaways that are fairly dramatic and the relationship to conflict?
The two are intertwined and cannot be disentangled. And one of the chapters in the book is on the Arctic, the high north, and another chapter in the book is on the environment and global warming and its impact on the oceans. And those two ideas cannot be pulled apart. So let's take the Arctic. Here at the top of the world, the high north, we have ice that is melting. And I suppose we could have a debate about why and how long and global warming and the causes. Frankly, I think that's settled science, but I'll tell you something as a simple mariner. The ice is melting. Therefore, as you point out, that Northwest Passage, as it's called by sailors, it's really an Arctic sailing route, is increasingly open all year round. It also means hydrocarbons up there are much more available to be exploited. And what's the geopolitics of the high north? On one side, you have Russia. On the other side, you have 5 NATO nations.
Right.
United States, Canada, Denmark by virtue of Greenland, Iceland, Norway. So you're primed for conflict in the one ocean where we've never had a war. So our mission has to be how we can ensure that the Arctic becomes a zone of cooperation, not a zone of conflict. To do that, we have to address not only the geopolitics, but also, in the broader sense, your point, the environment that's driving these changes in the North. Both of those fit together.
What about your choice of going to sea? You've done a lot of things where you were talking to me about your kind of academic interest in diplomacy, foreign policy, have come together with service on our nation's vessels. When did you decide that the Navy was going to be at least your choice of a college?
I grew up in a Marine family. In other words, my father was a Marine infantry officer, so a soldier, but one who would occasionally get on ships and go to sea. That's what Marines do, hence the name. But I wanted to be a Marine, as in an infantry officer, and I went to Annapolis, which provides both Navy and Marine Corps officers. So I went to Annapolis absolutely convinced I was going to be a Marine like my dad. I went through my whole first year very convinced. And then after your first year of college at Annapolis, the Naval Academy sends you out to sea, as midshipmen have gone to sea for centuries. And so I was assigned to a cruiser out of San Diego, the USS Jewett, beautiful ship. And we got underway from San Diego. We were headed west into a setting sun, and I had the first watch on the bridge, and I walked up on the bridge. I'd never been on the ocean before. I'd never been on the bridge of a ship. And I looked around at all that light and water, and I was like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. I thought, I want to be a sailor. And it was really that epiphanal for me. And from that point forward, I became fascinated with the oceans. I wanted to sail. I wanted to be on the sea. I wanted to be a ship's captain. And all those things eventually came true for me. So it was, I wish for everyone they had a moment like that where they suddenly knew what they wanted to do and they could follow that path, that true north. And it's made all the difference for me.
Yeah, I can well understand that, and I do think when you have that privilege in life to say,
I'm home.
I really love this. And
like you do.
Yeah,
and it comes across instantly when I meet you. Your love of this job, your love of this university, your love of this life of the mind.
You're very kind. You had a global institution, and in many ways you've been a leader for America in global settings.
Thank you. And
Vanderbilt, much like Fletcher and much like Tufts and much of the other great universities, many of us, we're just human capital organizations. And, if there is somebody from Dubrovnik or Denmark, Damascus, who's interested in, kind of medicine or comparative literature, we really feel like it's important for America to be the destination.
Sure.
And I remind people that there were times in our history, frankly, our recent history, where America was not the destination.
Sure.
And many of our own citizens would go to Germany to get their PhD training. Chancellor Kirkland, the second chancellor here, was trained in Europe. And,
or Oxford, Cambridge.
Oxford and Cambridge.
Magnets for generations of American graduate students.
So, Johns Hopkins, many of the early people are trained in Europe. So I've always felt like what America does really, 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 really well is university education and research, and the balance of trade of talented, diverse, smart people.
Yeah, it's a nice
you always want to make it a net positive. And of course, like you, I've got a strong immigrant background. So I feel like you bring people here who are smart, maybe determined, hungry. I want a better life.
Yeah.
But yet now we live in a time where, I'm not a politician. I don't do politics, but yet I do have to stand up for this is the role of America in the world in education. How do you think of your role at Fletcher after really a distinguished career of moving around the globe? And, well, if I'm the head of this Naval Command, I'm going to probably be in ports going through the Straits of Hormuz, and I'm going to be all over the world. How do you think about that and the restrictions on people coming into our country or staying in our country?
Well, I'm very lucky with the Fletcher School. It's the premier graduate school of international relations in the country by most standards. Now, I have to tell you, I'm not only the dean, but I'm a rabid alumni. I did my own PhD at the Fletcher School, so I'm a true believer. So you got to factor that into my evaluation. But 600 graduate students, half men, half women, half U.S., half international, typically 70 different nations represented on campus, average age 27, 28. These are mature young people. Average student speaks 3 languages. It is an international institution in every sense. So I completely resonate to your observation that the United States has a powerful comparative advantage in being attractive to these people, and everything we can do to bring them here, to educate them, to bring them into our society, show them our world with its faults and its beauty is crucial for America's role in the world. And every day, I wake up thinking about how we can connect better into this global ecosystem. And I'll close by saying we need to wake up to the fact that immigration helps the United States overall. There are certainly challenges associated with it, and we need to control our borders. I get all that. But at the end of the day, this is a nation built by immigrants. It continues to be an enormous source of comparative advantage, and particularly when we're attracting top-flight human capital to these magnificent universities like Vanderbilt, like Tufts, and many, many others. That's real power for our country, and that matters.
Yeah, I think it's almost part of American soft diplomatic power.
Totally.
That, if we travel around the world, you travel, the presidents of other universities travel around the world, they'll always welcome the leaders of our great universities.
Absolutely.
And we certainly might have differences in our conceptions of freedom and equality, but yet is there a common ground of we want to make society better and we want to invest in our young people. Do a lot of your graduates then return home to be diplomats, and do you feel you're really building a network of leaders in the world?
We are indeed. As we sit here today, there are 200 Fletcher graduates serving as ambassadors representing their country, almost half a dozen in the United States, the remainder from nations all around the world. Vietnam has 7 Fletcher graduates as ambassadors or ministers, for example. About a third of our graduates go into that kind of, if you will, pure public service for their nation. About a third go into international institutions, United Nations, International Committee for the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, the big NGOs and international organizations. And about a third go into international banking and finance, which I would argue is as important to building a global economy, creating jobs, helping underlie the national security of each of these nations. So it's about one-third, one-third, one-third. And myself, of course, spent a long period of time in the U.S. military, but the longer I was in the military, the more my career became focused on diplomacy overall. And I worked endlessly with the ambassadors of the United States all around the world, but really that diplomatic corps in every capital in Europe and in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Well, Jim, I'm going to let you get to the green room because we've got more time tonight. So I want to thank you for being here today and for your lifelong service to our nation and indeed our globe. It's an honor to have you here at Vanderbilt. We'll get a lot of interest in this, so let me just say you can get this by downloading this and other episodes of the Zeppos Report at vu.edu/Zeppos-report. That's vu.edu/Zeppos-report. Jim, thanks for being with us today.
Nick, thank you very much, sir.